in the lively coastal town of Ankaru, where the air always smelled of salt and grilled plantains, and the wind danced with the rhythm of drums, lived a girl named Abeni. Ankaru was full of life, its salt markets always buzzing, boats clinking against the shore, and every evening filled with the sound of music floating through the alleys. But while the town was loud and alive, Abeni was the opposite, quiet, soft-spoken, always tucked away in the shadows of her father's boat shed. She wasn't invisible because she lacked beauty. In fact, many noticed the way her deep brown eyes seemed to hold the ocean itself, or how her voice, when she sang sea hymns, made even the fishermen pause. But Abeni never tried to be seen. She was content fixing sails, scraping boat hulls, and humming tunes her late mother once sang. Her mother, taken by the sea during a violent raid when Abeni was just a baby, had left her nothing but a delicate necklace of old seashells, strung together with faded thread. Abeni wore it every day, not for style, but as a quiet memory wrapped around her neck. Despite her silence, people in the market whispered about her voice. Some swore they had heard her sing an ancient hymn only the royal women used to sing during mourning. Others dismissed it as wind playing tricks. But Abeni, unaware of her deeper roots, kept to her world, simple, small, and unseen. In a town that adored noise and glitter, she was the breeze no one noticed, until everything changed. Azimbola came from the dazzling merchant city of Jubari, where people walked in gold-threaded robes and every meal was a performance. She was used to attention, how heads turned when she passed, how merchants bowed a little deeper just for her smile. Her pride was loud, and her desire for power ran even louder. When she married Jabero, Abeni's father, she brought with her trunks of silk, jars of rare spices, and a daughter named Fayela, who she treated like a future queen. But she also brought something else, a deep, cold dislike for Abeni. Zimbola didn't understand Abeni's silence. She didn't like her calm presence, her simple clothes, or the way people sometimes stared at her with quiet admiration. Abeni didn't need shiny things to be noticed, and that irritated Zimbola more than she could admit. In her eyes, the spotlight had space for only one girl, her own daughter, Fayela. Fayela had everything Abeni didn't. She wore imported fabric, gold rings on every finger, and perfume that could fill an entire room. Zimbola treated her like royalty, telling her every day, "You were born for the palace, my star." She fed her stories of grand futures, arranged private tutors to teach her royal etiquette, and kept her away from chores like they were poison. Fayela grew up believing the world should serve her. Her beauty made people stop and stare, but her attitude pushed them away just as fast. Meanwhile, Abeni became the invisible shadow of the house. Zimbola gave her old clothes patched too many times, made her sleep in the salt room where the walls sweated and the air burned her lungs. The salt room was meant for storage, not people. But Zimbola said, "It's fitting for a girl with no shine." Abeni never argued. She curled herself into corners at night, her mother's shell necklace clutched in her hand, dreaming of the sea and peace. If there was a wedding, a festival, or any celebration in Ankaru, Zimbola made sure Abeni stayed behind. "No one needs to see you," she would snap. "You'll bring nothing but pity to our name." She would dress Fayela in bright blue robes and take her through the markets, parading her in front of nobles and whispering, "Soon, the king will notice us." Behind all this cruelty was fear. Zimbola saw something in Abeni she couldn't explain, an aura that pulled people in, even in silence. She couldn't let Abeni outshine Fayela, not when she had built her entire life around Fayela's future rise. So every kind word someone offered Abeni, Zimbola twisted it into insult. Every opportunity she blocked. She wanted the town to forget Abeni existed. But the one thing Zimbola couldn't touch was Abeni's soul. No matter how cruel the days became, Abeni remained kind. She still helped Fayela without complaint, still cared for her aging father, still sang to herself when no one listened. Zimbola didn't know that those quiet hymns would one day echo through the palace gates. She thought silence meant weakness, but Abeni's silence was just the calm before the storm, a storm that Zimbola would never be able to control. The sun was just beginning to rise over the red-tiled roofs of Ankaru when a golden-dressed royal messenger rode through the town gates, his horse's hooves echoing like drums. He stopped at the market square, unrolled a scroll with a seal from the palace of King Tandari, and spoke words that made the whole town freeze in place. The king was calling for a grand celebration, one that hadn't happened in a decade, the Circle of Voices. This was not just any feast or festival. It was a sacred tradition where the king would choose one girl from among the people to become the kingdom's voice, a role of deep honor and influence. This woman would speak in royal matters, travel between towns, and act as the bridge between rulers and people. But this time, there was a twist. The king's advisors declared that the selection would not be based on beauty, wealth, or noble birth. Instead, they sought the spirit of truth, humility, and unity, the very heart of Nkaru. Every home, no matter how poor or powerful, was required to send all eligible daughters to the palace. No exceptions, no exclusion. When Zimbola heard the news, her wine cup slipped from her hand and shattered. Her heart raced, not with excitement, but dread. This was the opportunity she had groomed Fayela for since birth. She had polished her for the palace like gold, preparing for this moment even before it was announced. But now she had a problem she couldn't control: Abeni. By royal order, Abeni had to be presented just like Fayela, and that terrified Zimbola more than anything. She knew Abeni didn't wear fine clothes or perform in front of crowds. But she also knew something deeper. People listened when Abeni spoke. Her presence held weight, and her silence carried more meaning than Fayela's practiced speeches. Zimbola sat up late that night, pacing, chewing the edge of her scarf. She wanted to scream at the law for being so cruel to her plan, but she couldn't break a royal decree. Not even she was that foolish. If she tried to leave Abeni behind, the whole town would whisper, and the palace would surely find out. Disobeying the king meant exile, or worse. So she began to scheme. If she couldn't hide Abeni, she would ruin her. She would make sure Abeni showed up looking unworthy, unnoticed, and invisible. She would crush any chance the girl had of being chosen. To Zimbola, this wasn't just a celebration, it was war. A royal stage was about to open, and only one of her daughters could walk it. The idea that it might be Abeni made her blood boil. Outside, Abeni stood quietly, her fingers wrapped around her mother's old shell necklace. She didn't understand what this event meant for her future, but deep inside, something stirred, a soft flame, a silent pull, like the sea whispering to her soul, telling her the time had come to be seen. As the day of the royal celebration grew closer, the town buzzed with excitement. Girls practiced dances in the courtyards, mothers rushed to the markets to buy beads and fabrics, and the air smelled of fresh oils and roasted yams. In Zimbola's home, preparations were louder, more intense. She had made up her mind. Fayela would walk into the palace glowing like royalty, and Abeni would be nothing but a shadow beside her. Zimbola brought in tailors from Jubari to stitch a sky-blue silk gown for Fayela, threaded with gold vines that shimmered with every step. She hired a poet to teach Fayela a poem filled with clever praise for the king, rehearsing it again and again until her voice sounded like honey. Zimbola placed heavy earrings on her daughter's ears, added bangles that clinked like music, and rubbed scented oils into her skin. Every movement of Fayela was rehearsed, every gesture planned. "You are the kingdom's future," Zimbola whispered with pride. "Walk like you already belong there." But when it came to Abeni, Zimbola had a different plan. She waited until the day before the ceremony to hand her a torn robe, brown, dusty, and shapeless. It had patches on the sleeves and a missing button at the neck. When Abeni looked at it in silence, Zimbola didn't stop there. She took a piece of charcoal from the stove and rubbed it roughly on Abeni's cheeks and forehead. "This is to protect you from the sun," she said with a wicked smile, but her eyes sparkled with cruelty. The truth was clear. She wanted Abeni to look like a joke. Then came her final blow. As Abeni stood quietly, Zimbola leaned in close and whispered, "You don't need to speak at the palace. Silence suits your kind." It wasn't the first time Abeni had been insulted, but something about those words cut deeper than before. Still, she didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply walked away, her mother's seashell necklace hidden under her old robe. Her heart ached, but her spirit didn't break. Inside, she still believed something that Zimbola could never touch, that truth always finds a way to rise. She didn't need silk or gold or poems written by strangers. She carried her own truth in her voice, in her memory, and in her blood. That night, while Fayella posed in front of the mirror, smiling at her reflection, Ebony sat in the salt room, looking up at the stars through the cracks in the ceiling. She sang a soft hymn to herself, the one her mother used to hum, a song that didn't need an audience. She knew the next day would not be easy. She knew the laughter, the stares, the whispers would come, but she would walk into the palace with her head held high, not to impress anyone, not to win, but because she was done hiding. She had no fancy words to say, but she didn't need them. Her silence was never empty. It was just waiting for the right moment to speak. The palace courtyard shimmered under hundreds of coral lanterns that swayed gently with the ocean breeze. Golden yam rolls stacked high on carved wooden tables. Dancers from distant provinces twirled with feathered fans, and the marble floor was softened with lion-skin carpets from the king's own hunts. The air buzzed with music, laughter, and excitement. Nobles, villagers, and royals all gathered, their eyes glinting with curiosity about which girl would be chosen as the kingdom's voice. When Fayella stepped into the courtyard, the light seemed to catch her just right. Her blue silk gown glowed like the sky at dawn, and the golden jewelry on her arms sang with every movement. She smiled confidently, pausing at the top of the steps, then began her performance. She danced in careful circle, every step rehearsed, every twirl perfect. Then she raised her voice in the praise lines she had practiced for weeks, her words dripping with sweet flattery for King Tandari and the royal court. People clapped, some nodded in approval. Zimbola stood near the front, lips curled in satisfaction, her chin held high. "That's my daughter," she whispered proudly to the noble beside her, "raised for this very night." But then the drums paused. A soft breeze carried a different energy into the space. Ebony entered, walking slowly, quietly, her head slightly bowed. Her robe hung loose and faded, her cheeks still marked with charcoal. She had no jewelry, no silk, no crowd around her. But as she stepped forward, something strange happened. The people parted, not out of respect, but confusion. Laughter rippled through the crowd, soft but sharp. Murmurs twisted into sneers. "Who let her in here?" someone hissed. "Is that a servant?" Ebony didn't react. She kept walking, each step steady, her eyes calm. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She simply refused to be invisible. From across the courtyard, Zimbola's eyes narrowed. She nudged Fayella and leaned closer with a hiss. "She thinks she belongs here?" Her voice dripped with disgust and fear that Ebony, even in rags, had somehow made the entire courtyard silent. Fear that all her efforts to hide this girl's light had failed. Ebony stopped near the edge of the gathering, far from the center, not trying to take space, but somehow space found her. Even without speaking, even without dancing, she held something none of the others did, a presence that couldn't be bought or polished. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was power waiting to unfold. People kept glancing at her. Not everyone laughed. Some stared a little longer, their expressions unsure. A few tilted their heads as if trying to remember where they had heard her voice before. The hymn, maybe. The quiet calm. The weight in her silence. The celebration continued, music rising again, but something had shifted. No longer was Fayella the only girl people watched, and Zimbola, with all her pride, could feel it deep in her chest. The girl she'd tried so hard to break had walked into the palace, barefoot, quiet, unwanted, and still, somehow, she was being seen. The celebration reached its peak, with drums pounding and dancers spinning in perfect rhythm. Nobles clinked their cups, and the scent of roasted meats filled the courtyard. But then Zimbola saw her moment. Her voice, loud and sharp, cut through the music like a blade. "Look at her," she said, pointing straight at Ebony. "Dressed in rags like a fishing net pulled from the sea." Her words rang out, bouncing off the palace walls. Some nobles gasped, but others laughed, unsure if they were mocking Ebony or just obeying Zimbola's lead. Fayella, standing near the royal platform, added fuel. "And that necklace," she sneered, gesturing at the string of old seashells around Ebony's neck. "Is that something she begged from the shore?" Her voice dripped with cruelty, eyes gleaming with pride, convinced that her victory was near. Laughter followed again, louder this time, and even the servants at the back couldn't hide their chuckle. But Ebony stood still. She didn't cry. She didn't run. Her hands gently held her necklace, and her eyes stayed soft, not angry. The salt in her wounds wasn't new. She had felt this before, lived with it, worn it like a second skin. Still, in that moment, she did something no one expected. She sang. At first it was barely a whisper, a soft note, low and trembling, like the hush of waves at night. But her voice slowly grew clearer. A hymn, a haunting, beautiful sea hymn that only a few in the courtyard recognized. Most stopped moving. The laughter faded. Some turned their heads, confused, curious. But one person knew that song well. King Tandari. His eyes locked on Ebony the moment the first few lines left her lips. The hymn she was singing was ancient, something not heard in generations. It was once sung only by royal women during moments of deep mourning. Most believed it was lost to time. Even the palace scribes no longer remembered all the words. Yet here was a girl in torn robes, a stranger singing it perfectly, every note flowing like wind over water. The king stood slowly, motioning for silence. Ebony didn't even notice. Her eyes were closed, her voice soft but sure. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. Somewhere deep in her spirit, the song had lived, waiting for a moment to return. When she stopped, the courtyard was frozen. You could hear the waves crashing in the distance. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, the king stepped forward, his face unreadable, his voice quiet. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked. Ebony looked up, her voice no louder than before. "From my mother," she said. The silence deepened. Zimbola's face turned pale. Fayella stepped back, because that song, only taught to women of the royal line, was not for commoners. And suddenly, everyone knew Ebony was not what they thought she was. Not a beggar, not a shadow, not a mistake. She was the voice they had all been waiting to hear. The courtyard still held its breath as Ebony's final note faded into the air, drifting into silence that felt deeper than sound. The guests stood frozen, eyes darting between her and the king. Ebony lowered her gaze, unsure of what would happen next. Her song hadn't been meant for attention. It had just come from a place inside her that couldn't stay quiet any longer. But King Tandari's face was still unreadable, his dark eyes fixed on her like he was seeing a ghost wrapped in truth. Then he moved. Without a single word, the king stepped down from his elevated platform, his long royal robe sweeping across the lion-skin carpets. His golden staff tapped softly on the marble floor, and the crowd parted as he walked toward Ebony. Even the loudest nobles didn't dare speak. He carried something in his hand, a golden orb, round as the sun, carved with ancient symbols of the royal line. It shimmered under the lantern light, but the glow wasn't just gold. It pulsed softly, like it had a heartbeat of its own. Ebony watched him approach, frozen in place, her hands clutched around her seashell necklace. The king stopped just in front of her. Without saying a word, he reached out and placed the orb gently into her palms. His eyes never left hers, and still, not a single word was spoken. The orb glowed brighter. Gasps rose from the crowd. The elders knew what it meant. That orb was no ordinary treasure. It was a sacred relic, passed down through generations of rulers. It responded only to those who shared royal blood. It was said that even the most noble lords had held it with no response. But now, in the hands of a girl dressed in rags, the orb pulsed like a living star. Zimbola broke the silence with a shriek. She pushed forward, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Surely that's for Fayella? That's a mistake. She's the one raised for this." But the orb didn't dim. Ebony's touch had awakened something in it, something that could not be faked or claimed through pride. The golden shell of the orb began to shift, folding open like petals of a flower. Inside, a flame danced, small, steady, and warm. It hovered gently over Ebony's palms, glowing with a quiet authority. The king raised one hand to silence Zimbola. "It has chosen," he said finally, his voice calm but powerful. "The blood remembers, even when people forget." Zimbola fell back, stunned, and Fayella stood frozen, the silk gown suddenly feeling like nothing more than costume. No rehearsed words, no gold, no mocking had mattered in the end. The crowd erupted, not in laughter this time, but in awe. They had seen something true. Ebony hadn't asked for anything. She had only come because she believed in showing up, even when the world tried to silence her. And now, the kingdom itself had answered. As Abeni stood holding the glowing orb, a soft hum began to rise from it, deep and ancient, like a song from the earth itself. The flame inside spun gently, then burst upward in a swirl of light. The crowd gasped as the orb projected a vision into the air above it, a glowing image made of golden mist. Faces turned upward, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The image showed a woman, tall, regal, beautiful, her eyes kind but fierce. Her skin shimmered with light, and her voice could almost be heard in the air, though her lips did not move. Around her neck hung a familiar necklace, one that no one could miss, the same string of seashells Abeni now wore. There was no doubt. Whispers shot through the crowd, like wind through tall grass. That's her mother. She looks like her. But how? Then another figure appeared in the glowing vision, younger, with a crown of black stone and gold. King Tandari, years ago. The woman placed her hand on his chest. Brother and sister. The air thickened with realization. Abeni's mother was not just a village woman. She was the king's own sister, a royal lost long ago during the rebellion of the Red Coast. Many had believed she'd died at sea. None knew she'd left behind a child. The vision faded slowly, the mist curling back into the orb. The courtyard was utterly silent. Not a single voice dared to speak. Then came the gasps. One by one, nobles began to kneel. The very people who had laughed at Abeni moments ago now bowed their heads. The same ones who had called her a servant now lowered themselves to the ground. Abeni stood frozen, overwhelmed, her breath trembling in her chest. She hadn't known this truth herself. She only knew the stories her heart carried. But the orb had spoken. The blood had remembered. The king looked at her with new eyes, not just as a girl who sang an old hymn, but as family, as a rightful heir to the royal line. His voice, firm and low, echoed across the courtyard. This is the child of my sister, born of storm and salt, hidden by fate, but never forgotten. Then he turned, lifting his hands as the final words of the ancient prophecy spilled from his lips. Words kept alive only by royal tongue. The voice of Enkaru shall rise from the salt and storm. The people bowed lower. Tears filled the eyes of the old, and murmurs of awe swept through the courtyard. Abeni, once dressed in rags and shame, now stood wrapped in light and legacy. Her silence had spoken louder than any rehearsed praise, and the kingdom had listened. From the salt rooms to the palace steps, her journey had led here, not by force, not by wealth, but by truth. She hadn't needed gold to shine. She had always been the storm's daughter, and now Enkaru would remember her name. The golden glow of the orb slowly faded, but the truth it had revealed still hung heavy in the air. Abeni stood quiet, her hands still wrapped gently around the sacred object, while nobles remained kneeling, and murmurs swept like waves through the courtyard. The king turned his gaze to Zimbola, and the warmth in his expression vanished. With a voice that needed no shouting, King Tandari declared, "Zimbola of Jubari, for your cruelty, your deceit, and your attempt to silence one of royal blood, you are hereby stripped of all merchant licenses. You are no longer welcome in the courts of this kingdom." His words cut through the silence like a blade. Zimbola's proud shoulders dropped. Her mouth opened to protest, but no sound came out. Her face twisted in disbelief, and she looked around as if someone would step forward to defend her, but no one did. The same nobles who once nodded politely at her now looked away. Some even shook their heads. She had built her life on pride and status, but in the end, none of that protected her from truth. She stumbled back, her once perfect robe dragging on the ground, the colors now dull against the shine of truth that surrounded Abeni. Guards approached to escort her out, but she didn't fight them. Her eyes, once sharp and judging, were now wide and hollow. Fayella stood beside the platform, trembling. Her silk gown suddenly felt like paper. The jewelry around her neck was cold and heavy. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Abeni, not with envy this time, but with deep regret. She covered her face with her hands and dropped to her knees. The laughter, the taunts, the pride, they all shattered inside her like broken glass. Her voice came out in a whisper, shaky and lost. I thought that was enough." No one answered. Some things couldn't be fixed with words. At the edge of the crowd, Jabiro, Abeni's father, stepped forward. His weathered face, usually hard from years of labor in the boat shed, was streaked with tears. He looked at Abeni like he was seeing her for the first time, and at the same time, seeing his late wife all over again. His hands trembled as he reached for her, gently placing one calloused hand on her shoulder. "I never knew," he said softly, his voice breaking. "She never told me." But he wasn't angry. His tears were full of joy, of relief, of pride. He had raised Abeni with what little he had, never knowing he was raising royalty. And now, in front of all the kingdom, the daughter he had protected had become the voice of truth. Zimbala was gone, Fayela's mask had fallen, and Abeni, who had once been hidden in the shadows, now stood in the full light of destiny. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't speak cruelly in return. She only stood quietly, like she always had, letting her truth rise like the tide, strong, steady, and unstoppable. The celebration that followed Abeni's revelation was unlike anything the town of Nkaru had ever seen. Drums beat into the night, flames danced high in the palace torches, and the people sang her name with joy, no longer in mockery, but in admiration. At the center of it all stood Abeni, calm, steady, and still the same girl who used to hum sea hymns in her father's boat shed. But now, she was more. She had become the kingdom's voice, a title carried only by those chosen once in a generation, not for beauty or wealth, but for spirit, truth, and strength. The king stood before the people and placed a new necklace around her neck, this one woven with silver threads and carved coral, a sign of her royal standing. But she still wore her mother's seashell necklace too, a quiet reminder of where she came from. With her voice, she would guide the court, speak for the people, and guard the kingdom's heart. Abeni was no longer hidden. She was the storm's daughter, now standing with the crown's blessing. In the months that followed, Abeni didn't seek riches or grand palaces. Instead, she returned to the coast, where her story had begun, among salt winds and crashing waves. There, she built something new, a school for girls, perched near the cliffs where the ocean sang loudest. She named it House of Storms and Salt. It welcomed daughters from every background, merchants' children, fisher girls, even those who had once mocked her. They learned not just reading and numbers, but courage, kindness, and truth. She walked among them in simple robes, her feet often bare, singing old hymns that now felt like the anthem of a new future. Abeni taught them that strength wasn't in loud voices or pretty gowns, but in knowing who you are, even when the world tries to silence you. Fayela came one day, quietly, with her eyes lowered and her heart heavy. Abeni welcomed her with a nod, and no words were needed. The past was done. The future had room for healing. Abeni's name became legend, but she never chased glory. She only stood in the light of truth and let it speak for itself. Her school grew. Her voice echoed in council halls. And every time the sea breeze blew, the people of Nkaru remembered the girl who once walked into a royal gathering in rags and left with a kingdom's heart. "Gold fades," she would say to her students with a soft smile, "but voices echo forever, and truth rises, even in rags."